Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze with the Conscious Resistance Network, and today we are going to continue our ongoing conversation about water fluoridation and particularly the Fluoride Action Network lawsuit against the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm here with the lead attorney in that lawsuit, Michael Connett. How are you doing today, Michael?
I'm doing well. Thanks, Derrick, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it seems like this is a perfect time for an update. For those who've been following, you guys know I went to San Francisco back in February and was there for the duration of the second phase of the lawsuit and was able to interview Michael as well as Dr. Howard Hu, Dr. Bruce Lamphere, and Dr. Philippe Grandjean about their work on this situation and on the harms of fluoride as it relates to neurodevelopment. And now here we are, Michael, in October, and we actually have a ruling which seemed like it might not ever come. Tell everybody, let's just start right there. What did the ruling say, and where do you think things go from here?
Yes, well, it was a fantastic decision by the court, very detailed, very thorough, 80 pages. The court determined that adding fluoride chemicals to drinking water poses an unreasonable risk to human health in the form of reduced IQ in children. So it was a 7-year process. The judge heard a great amount of evidence and expert testimony and reached the conclusion, as we argued in the case, the judge agreed that fluoridation does pose an unreasonable risk to human health. And based on that finding, the court has ordered EPA to begin a rulemaking proceeding to address and eliminate this risk.
And I think if I was reading correctly on the press release that came out from Fluoride Action Network, that as part of that rulemaking process, it is possible, and you mentioned this to me back in February when I was asking you, well, what comes next if you do win? It is possible still that the EPA could drag on this rulemaking process for months, years, if they choose, in addition to potentially appealing the ruling. Is that correct?
That's right. And EPA has demonstrated for a very long time that it is perfectly willing to drag its feet as long as possible to do anything meaningful to protect the public from fluoride. So, I am concerned that we will see EPA attempt again to drag its feet, but there may be legal remedies available for us to compel EPA to move quicker than it otherwise would be willing to do so. But I do think, Derrick, that it's important for everyone out there to keep in mind that there's nothing stopping local communities from taking action now. And we've already seen communities across the U.S. after the court issued its ruling, pausing and suspending its fluoridation program and ending its fluoridation program in light of the court's ruling that this is a significant and unreasonable risk to children's developing brains. So I really encourage people out there. As an attorney, I'm going to be doing everything I can at the federal level to make sure that the EPA does the right thing, namely ban the addition of fluoridation chemicals throughout the United States. That's what we think is required now to effectively address this risk, right? That's what I'm going to be doing. But in the meantime, I think communities really should be taking a good hard look at the question of whether we should be adding a neurotoxicant to drinking water, a chemical that affects the brain. Because, Derrick, as you saw at trial, there was no dispute amongst the experts on EPA's side that fluoride does affect the brain, that fluoride is a neurotoxicant at some level of exposure. The only question in the case was, well, what is the precise level at which it goes from safe to toxic, right? And how does that dose vary based on an individual susceptibility? But there was no dispute that we are now dealing with a neurotoxicant. And so I really think it's time for communities to really readdress this issue. And hopefully we will see many communities in the months ahead taking this chemical out of the water.
Yeah, I think that's the important part right now. Obviously, again, congratulations to you and your team. This is a hard fought victory here. It's taken 8 years now. And I do think that point that you just mentioned is really key for everybody at home. There is just a few hours from where I am right now in Houston, Texas, Abilene, Texas. They've already announced that they're pausing their water fluoridation program while they sort of wait to see what the EPA does. I plan to go to my city council next week in Houston, and I don't even really live here full time anymore, but I'm here, so I'm going to use the ruling. And of course, we're going to talk about the NTP, the final report from the NTP in just a moment. I'm going to use both of those bits of information as well as the announcement from the Abilene city government to go to the Houston City Council and say, are you guys ready to act? Because I actually went for the first time to City Council related to fluoride back in 2013, and we were building up a movement out here. It was a group called Fluoride Free Houston, and very quickly, representatives from the American Dental Association showed up to basically say we didn't know what we were talking about. Well, now we have the ruling from a federal court. We have the NTP report. We have references to show that other cities are already taking action. And I think each of those bits of information can be used in this fight by activists like myself and others out there who might be hearing this. It's a positive thing we got the ruling, but we shouldn't sit around and wait for the EPA to act because, as we just said, it could take a while. The other thing you mentioned is that there was an admission by the EPA, I believe, if I remember correctly, Dr. Stanley Barone, who was both a witness on your side as well as for the EPA, who was kind of pushed into a corner with your great work. Honestly, it was wonderful watching you in your element in court admit that, as you said, there is harm. They just can't pinpoint at what point, where does that start and things of that sort. This was mentioned by Judge Chen in his ruling, this uncertainty that still does exist. But could you elaborate on that section? What exactly was he getting at about that we know there's some uncertainty, but either way, action needs to be taken?
Right. Well, as you've probably seen, the American Dental Association and some of the organizations that promote fluoridation have latched on to that comment from the court that there is some uncertainty about the level of fluoride that causes IQ loss. But the thing about that, Derrick, as you saw at trial, is if we were to use the standard of certainty for regulating environmental chemicals, then virtually every regulation that we have today to protect the public from toxic chemicals would disappear overnight. Because what you will see in EPA risk assessment is you virtually never have certainty as to the dose that causes the harm. There's always a level of uncertainty. And that's the purpose of risk assessment, is how do you best navigate the uncertainty in a way that will protect the public? Because what you don't want to do is you don't want to wait for the big oops moment where you're like, oh, sorry, yep, it's now definitively 100% absolute clear that we've just poisoned 200 million people. You want to take action before you have that level of proof. And that's what the EPA does every single day. And that's what they've done for every other chemical under this Toxic Substances Control Act. And so what we asked the court to do, and the court agreed, is don't treat fluoride any differently than other toxic chemicals. So if you don't need certainty, absolute certainty for other toxic chemicals before you regulate them, before you protect the public from them, then we shouldn't require that of fluoridation either. And the court agreed with that. And what the court did here is it simply applied EPA's standard risk assessment framework to fluoride. That's what the court did. And when you do that, Derrick, when you apply EPA's risk assessment principles and procedures to fluoride, it becomes very obvious very quickly that we are dealing with a very risky program, that the doses of fluoride that people are getting from the water are far exceed the levels that we should be comfortable with if we are interested in protecting people from harmful toxic effects.
And as you mentioned there, and I remember hearing in February, this is the same procedure that was used to come up with the regulations for mercury and for lead. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's the standard approach that EPA takes. I mean, EPA never requires certainty of harm at the regulatory level. You don't require that. But what you do, and not to get too wonky here, but what EPA typically does, and in fact always does, is you try to find out the level of exposure at which you are consistently observing the adverse toxic effect. That's called the hazard level. Okay. Now the hazard level is not a safe level. So you're not content just to take the acceptable level and just make it a hair below the observed hazard level, because that's bound to cause lots of problems, right? So you need to have a buffer between the level that you are consistently observing harm, the hazard level, and the level that humans are being exposed to. That's called a margin of safety, or EPA sometimes calls it the margin of exposure. You need a margin. And the EPA has never used a margin of safety for fluoride. But when the court's analysis, the court implemented a margin for fluoride. And in doing so, it was very clear that the exposures we're getting from fluoridated water are precariously close to the danger level, to the levels that we consistently see IQ loss in children. And that is the framework for risk assessment. And the court determined that, yes, fluoridated water presents a risk of the hazard of IQ loss.
Yeah, and obviously this particular lawsuit was focused on the neurotoxic effects. And for those who are versed in fluoride research, you will know there are other problems that Dr. Howard Hu spoke to me about, including liver and other issues. So, we're kind of zeroed in on this one element, which is obviously important: brain development, particularly, within pregnant mothers and children. That's something I think everybody cares about. But this is just one piece of the bigger puzzle, that fluoride is causing harm to humans, and this case, particularly in the United States. I wanted to zero in on another statement from the ruling from Judge Chin, which I think is important, because we'll talk about the NTP study in just a moment. But when that came out, which was also a big move, and obviously that preceded Judge Chin's final ruling, the corporate media, the mainstream media, immediately kind of seized on certain statements within the NTP ruling and essentially tried to say this doesn't apply to the United States. But Judge Chen makes it very clear. He says, quote, "The court finds that fluoridation of water at 0.7 milligrams per liter, the level presently considered optimal in the United States, poses an unreasonable risk of reduced IQ in children." I mean, to me, that couldn't be more clear, and I'm glad he was so direct with his statements. But and you also touched on how some of the ADA and the pro-fluoridation groups are already kind of trying to find whatever they can to dismiss this. But what do you think is the importance of that statement there and others that he made, to really make it clear to people that we're talking about the current levels promoted by the CDC and other health organizations in the United States, that this is relevant to the United States current fluoridation levels?
Yeah, there's no doubt. I mean, if you read the court's opinion, the court, as you noted, is very clear that the level of fluoride that we add to drinking water for fluoridation, which is 0.7 parts per million, presents an unreasonable risk of IQ loss for children. Point blank. That was the court's conclusion. Unreasonable risk of IQ loss for children. But what, this goes back again to the difference between the hazard level and the risk level. Those are two different things. If you look at the NTP report, which was a very comprehensive, systematic review of the scientific literature on fluoride and IQ by the subject experts at the NIH on toxicology, the NTP concluded that above 1.5 parts per million in the water, so that's about about 2 times higher than the optimal level for fluoridation. At that level, above 1.5, you consistently see this association between fluoride and reduced IQ. Now, that would be what you would call the hazard level, okay? That's where we are consistently observing the hazard. And so the American Dental Association, others have been like, oh, it's 1.5 parts per million. What's the big deal? That's 2 times higher than 0.7. Nothing to see here. Let's move on. No big deal, right? But that's not how risk assessment works. Because again, with risk assessment, what you're looking to do is make sure that the human exposure level, that there's a sufficient buffer between the hazard level and the exposure level. And if that margin is too small, if it's precariously small, the exposure level is too close to where you are consistently observing harm, that's a risk. That's the way the EPA analyzes chemical hazards and chemical risks. And what the ADA wants to do is the ADA wants to eliminate risk assessment when it comes to fluoride. It wants to create a double standard. Let's treat fluoride differently than we treat all other chemicals, right? Let's require absolute proof of harm at the human exposure level before we take any action. That's what the ADA wants to do, but that is not how EPA does it. And again, if we were to take the ADA's approach, okay, then you would need to eliminate virtually every single regulation that is currently protecting Americans from the harmful effects of chemicals, because that's the way EPA does. That's the way EPA regulates chemicals. Okay. It doesn't require certainty of harm at the human exposure level. And, when we think about the ADA, Derrick, this is an organization that has for over 170 years, dating back to the middle of the 19th century, has promoted the addition of mercury into people's mouths through, quote, silver fillings. Mercury, which is a very neurotoxic chemical, something that you do not want to be exposed to. And for over 170 years, the ADA has been promoting the use of mercury in silver fillings, which we know is released into the mouth, that gets into the bloodstream, right? So the ADA has very little credibility when it comes to the toxic consequences of the materials used in dentistry. ADA's job has always been promote, but not to take a objective, neutral look at the toxicity of the chemicals and products it promotes.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Michael. I wasn't even aware of that there's still, that they've promoted mercury for that long. And I'm hoping that this ruling, and as the information gets out and as more people become aware of this, because as you know, you did a great job getting to this point. We got the NTP report, but if the media doesn't really report on it, then the vast majority of people have no idea this is even a thing. And they will, they're still buying fluoride toothpaste. They're still getting dental fluoride treatments and things of that sort. But I would hope that in the end, that the credibility of the American Dental Association and the various other pro-fluoridation groups, which are still out there adamantly promoting it, is just completely lost and completely destroyed at this point, because they don't, it's not a credibility they deserve. And it's continued to lead Americans just completely astray, and more than astray, towards harm. That's just hurting them on a daily basis. And I think that's really a horrible thing to see. So I hope in the end, the ADA will not have the reputation it currently does, because the average person, and I think especially, again, in my experience going to city council, we had dozens of people showing up for weeks. We were meeting with city council members, but the moment that an ADA representative chose to show up and basically said, none of these people are dentists, none of these people are scientists, I'm the one here with the credibility and the credentials, that's basically what happened. They stopped listening to us in favor of, well, the ADA still promotes this, the CDC promotes this. Do you think that's something we might see long-term as far as the credibility of these institutions being weakened?
I certainly do. I mean, I think the American Dental Association has violated the trust that the American public placed in it on the issue of fluoride. And I think the Centers for Disease Control and its oral health division has violated the trust that the public placed in it, because the public is not looking to these organizations to be cheerleaders for policies that they like. The public is looking for objective, honest assessment, even if the objective, honest assessment goes against their policy preferences. We're not looking for cheerleaders. We're looking for honest communication. And so, yeah, I think the American Dental Association, the CDC, have violated the trust that people have placed in it. But I think also, Derrick, a broader point that I would make here is that, dentists certainly have an important role to play in, advising us on teeth, right? Like, is a certain product good for your teeth, right? That's their specialty, the teeth. But with fluoride, once you swallow the fluoride, once it gets past the teeth and you swallow it and it goes into your body, it goes into your brain, it goes into your thyroid, it goes into your bones, it goes into your kidney, it goes into your pineal gland. The jurisdiction, if you will, of dentists no longer applies. Like, that's not their specialty, right? So I think it's always been, there's always been a misplaced reliance on the dentistry profession to advise us on the wisdom and the safety of adding fluoride chemicals to drinking water. I think it's fair for dentists to provide their opinions on the dental effects, but for the systemic health and the health consequences of fluoride exposure, we really should be looking more towards toxicologists, environmental epidemiologists, and people who have expertise in investigating how chemicals can affect our health in a much broader way than just looking at the teeth. And that's what the court did in this case. As you know, I mean, the court heard expert testimony from scientists who have done cutting edge very standard setting research on mercury, on the hazards of mercury, on the hazards of lead. And so the court was hearing from the very types of experts that we should have been looking to help advise us on whether fluoridation is a safe policy. Those voices have been ignored for too long.
Absolutely. And one other, I guess, just briefly, I want to get to the NTP report, but you just reminded me, and I'm just curious your thoughts and all the research you've done for the lawsuit, and then, obviously your family involved with the Fluoride Action Network. What are your thoughts on the fact that we have data and we have mainstream reporting from the Washington Post, even back in the 90s, about scientists who were trying to blow the whistle that far back about the, associations of potential cancer concerns with fluoride, and just other aspects of that. Scientists who were, their careers were sort of tainted, or they were attacked, and their character was definitely impugned for speaking up about these matters. Is that something? Obviously, it wasn't particularly relevant to the lawsuit and the neurodevelopmental issues, but what are your thoughts on that? I mean, does this, in your mind, is this indicative of, I don't want to say a conspiracy, but of some corporate influence and clear interest that did not want this topic to become a mainstream issue, and that instead would rather it remain in that realm of, you're just a conspiracy theorist, there's nothing to see here?
Well, this is a subject that is near and dear to me. The sort of the history that you've pointed to here, and something that I've spent a lot of time researching over the years. And one thing I can say, Derrick, with absolute confidence, and I have a lot of documents going back to the 1940s to demonstrate this, but there has been a long-standing history of what I call data suppression on the fluoride issue, where findings and conclusions that were adverse to the fluoridation program have been airbrushed away from what ultimately is provided to the public. And so there has, and that's something that has, I think, ultimately served to grossly distort the public's understanding on the risks of fluoride exposure, because the government, federal health agencies have for so long presented such a superficial assessment on fluoride, where it's all good all the time, no problems at all. And that goes back to what I was saying earlier, Derrick. Like, the public's not looking to federal health agencies to be cheerleaders for the policies that they love, okay? We're looking to the federal health agencies to provide the facts, good or bad, about these chemicals, so that we can make informed decisions about how we and our families want to use these chemicals. Like, it's not, they shouldn't be in the position of just, well, if the public hears this fact, they may not really want to support fluoridation anymore. And so we shouldn't tell them that fact. Like, no, that shouldn't be their role. They should just give us the facts, good and bad, and let all of us make informed decisions about how we want to use this stuff. And I can tell you, Derrick, that there is a long-standing history on the fluoride issue where the bad facts on fluoride, the concerns raised by scientists in these agencies, have been censored and suppressed. And that has led to a distorted, superficial understanding on the risks of fluoride exposure.
Absolutely. I was sitting here pulling up an article from the Washington Post. I think it was 1996. I mean, you can find some of these older reports that obviously most people have never seen, or they were, 20 plus years ago. So the average person isn't aware of them. And I think that's been, just on like a personal side, one of the most frustrating things, and I'm sure something you've dealt with as well, fighting this battle. But as somebody who's from the activist and journalist front, trying to report on these and trying to spread this information to people, sitting down with the expert witnesses, putting in the time and effort to try to broadcast this information as wide as possible, to be deemed conspiracy theorists by city council members, by the former mayors, laughed out of the room. And as I mentioned earlier, I feel a sort of a renewed vigor with this fight, though. I mean, it's been so important to me, and to be in the trial in San Francisco was just a really powerful experience. And now that we have the ruling, I feel like it's time to kind of put some more energy into that fight on the local level, because you've done a lot of the groundwork. The judge has made the right ruling. Now we have to see where it goes. But I think it is up to everybody else who cares about this issue to not sit around and wait, but to take this information and take it to their town council, city council, county commissioner's court, whatever you've got, the people who are making the decisions about what's going in your water, to bring this information to them. Because if they're hearing about it at all, they're not necessarily going to be in a rush to broadcast it to the people. Unfortunately, as you said, we have, from the federal, and my experience in Houston, at least down to the local level, vested interests who are cheerleaders for fluoride and who are not really going to want to, I think, potentially open themselves up not only to criticism, but I guess this is another question. Like, is there a potential for class action lawsuits as a result of this? Like, could people out there try to make some claims and say, well, maybe my child has ADHD or has lost some IQ points because of exposure, and the CDC and my local government and my local health department and the ADA have all been recommending this? Is that a potential, not necessarily related to your case, but could somebody else take that up? And if so, do you think that's what the government's afraid of?
Well, that's, I have been thinking through a little bit of that, Derrick, and I think at this point in time, I might just hold off on commenting on the potential legal avenues for relief at this point with respect to water fluoridation. I think it's going to be a question that, people will be asking in the years ahead, but it's, at this point in time, I don't feel like I'm at a point where I can comment on that with the level of sort of legal rigor that I would want to be able to provide on that. Okay.
Sure.
But I do, to your point though, your first point, I think one of the things that is very attractive about the fluoride issue is that it's one of the issues that we have an ability to influence and affect, right? Like, there's some issues of political corruption and things that, we read about, we learn about, and we're outraged by, right? That it's very hard for us as citizens on the ground to do much about, right? And they may be much more important ultimately than the fluoride issue, right? But with the fluoride issue, you have the ability to actually bring about positive change that, bring about justice. We see it happening every year where you have communities across the country who are organizing and getting the fluoride chemicals taken out of their water supply. So it's something that can definitely be done on the local level. And I do think that the court's ruling, which is really like, if you're coming from the position, right, and if you've bought in what the standard narrative is on fluoridation, this court's ruling is shocking, right? Like, it's shocking. It's so fundamentally at odds with the orthodoxy, that I do think it's really going to bring about a lot of rethinking from people who previously probably would not have been open to considering the issue. And I'm really encouraged by that, because I really just want us to, I really want us just to get to a rational discussion on fluoride. Like, get rid of the cultural baggage. Just look at this anew. Look at it with fresh eyes. And if you do, you look around the world and you see that the vast majority of Europe has long ago rejected this. Their teeth aren't falling out. Their teeth are perfectly fine. In fact, their cavity rates are generally lower than the United States. Look at what the Centers for Disease Control has already admitted, that you don't actually need to swallow fluoride, that the benefit, the predominant benefit, is topical, just applying it to your teeth. So why are we adding a chemical to the drinking water that you don't actually need to swallow, right? Like, because when you put something in your water, you're swallowing that stuff, not only in your water, but all the foods and beverages made with that water. And what we have here in the United States is we are the most fluoridated nation on earth. Over half of the people on this planet that drink fluoridated water live here in the US. So we're the most fluoridated nation. And as a result, we have a contaminated food supply. Our processed foods and processed beverages are like most of them are contaminated with the fluoridated water that's used to make them. So it's an issue that, if people look at it anew, let some of that cultural baggage, those preconceptions go, right? No longer look at this about Dr. Strangelove. Like, so many people, when they hear fluoridation, their first thing is, oh, Dr. Strangelove, oh, our precious bodily fluids. Okay. They look at you like you are, like a moron for even thinking about this issue, right? And I would just ask, for those people, and I get it. I mean, that's what it's not surprising that people would look at it that way, because so much of the information streams that they have that's the message that they get. That's the narrative that they're exposed to. So I get it, but I would just encourage people who have that sort of knee-jerk reaction, just pause for a second. Pause and just look at this issue again. And just, and I think that we really need to do that. We're at a point where we all really should just do that. Take pause. Don't look at this the way you have always looked at this issue. Should we really be adding a neurotoxin to our drinking water?
Yeah, it's a great question. I was going to mention Dr. Strangelove if you didn't, because that is seriously one of the most stereotypical responses. I mean, that goes off into a whole conversation maybe about propaganda and things of that sort. But I definitely think that is a common response that many people have shared with me over the years, especially when I've tried to fight this issue on the local level. So hopefully people can, as you say, revisit the topic with a fresh set of eyes and an open mind and critical thinking. Before we get to wrap it up here, I do want to touch a little further on the NTP report. Those who've been following my reporting for the past several years, you know that this is the National Toxicology Program, the monograph, and that it was long delayed. And it's really, again, thanks to you, Michael, and your team, that we were able to get emails showing that this report was supposed to be ready for release back in May 2022, that the scientists at the NTP said that it was ready for release. And you mentioned the CDC's Oral Health Division earlier. We know that the CDC's Oral Health Division was part of the conversations about this, and other members of the U.S. government, and they were involved in blocking the release of this. We see the mention of Rachel Levine, Richard Tabak, others. That to me is still like an issue that just hasn't been dealt with, and I don't know if we ever will get any sort of accountability for that. I've tried to raise awareness about that, but there, in my mind, there should be a congressional investigation into this. Now we've got a federal ruling on it. There should be somebody looking into why this report was delayed. But setting that all aside for a moment, tell us about the final report and what it concluded and what role this played in getting to the final ruling from Judge Chen.
Right. Well, so just the context here is, we had our first trial in this case in the summer of 2020. And, I thought our evidence came in very nicely. The court was clearly concerned about what the evidence indicated about fluoridation's effect on IQ. But the court at that time put the case on hold because the court knew that the NTP was working on a systematic review. And, understandably so, the court wanted to be able to consider the NTP's conclusions, whatever they might be. And so the case was put on hold, and we waited and waited for the NTP to finish its report. And then 2 years later, in 2022, I got word from a person with knowledge that the NTP had completed its report, and that the NTP was being blocked from publishing it. And naturally, that was of great concern to me because our lawsuit had been placed on hold to wait for that report to come public. So the fact that the NTP had completed it and were being prevented from publishing it was deeply concerning. And I immediately went to the court, and I think the court was troubled by that as well. And so we ended up through that process obtaining a large number of documents, email communications, at all levels of the HHS, all the way up to the Assistant Secretary of Health, Rachel Levine's office, which really clearly, with little ambiguity, demonstrated that the Assistant Secretary of Health office, the CDC, and the National Institute of Dental and Craniofacial Research, which is a very strong pro-fluoride body at the NIH, that they all work together to prevent the NTP from issuing its report. And it was a very politicized process, and a very troubling one because, the NTP is supposed to be a non-policy based organization. It's supposed to just be about the science, and it's not supposed to be about policy. And yet here you had all these policy driven organizations that had the trump card to keep the NTP from publishing its report. So, but to the NTP's great credit, and I think it's something that I'm certainly impressed with and thankful for, is that the scientists at the NTP didn't just give up and go home, which would have been totally understandable for them to do because they were facing so much blowback from, higher ups at the HHS, but the NTP stuck with it. And, and they, as you noted, they ended up publishing the systematic review this August. And so it's now a published final document, and you can find it right on the NIH website. And it concluded that fluoride is consistently associated with reductions in IQ, and that there's high quality evidence supporting this, and that this association between fluoride and IQ deficits cannot be explained by the kinds of things that you would look to sort of assess whether this association may be a mere artifact of something else, right? The NTP looked to see whether factors like socioeconomics or parental education or exposures to other toxic chemicals, whether those types of factors could explain this consistent association between fluoride and reduced IQ. And the NTP's conclusion is no, those other factors do not appear to be likely explanations for this relationship that we see. And so, the long and short of it is the NTP agreed that fluoride basically reduces IQ. And that's a pretty significant conclusion coming from the federal government. Because, Derrick, when we started fluoridation back in the 1940s, this was supposed to be about one and only one thing, the teeth. The idea that this is a chemical that also impacts the brain was not part of the equation. It was not part of the bargain when people agreed to start this program of fluoridation. So now that we know that fluoride is a neurotoxicant, and when you have a sort of an authoritative body like the NTP saying as much, it's really time, really time for an entire reorientation on fluoride and how we use it. And in my view, it's high time for the U.S. to follow Europe's lead and take fluoride out of the water, but have it available in toothpaste and dental products, so that anyone who wants to use fluoride, it's readily available. It's actually very cheap. Fluoride toothpaste is not expensive. And allow everyone the right to choose to use it. And the benefit of that is twofold. One, the right to choose. And two, you're using it in a much more effective and safer way, because you're putting the fluoride on the teeth, which is the one part of the body that stands to benefit, and then you're spitting it out. So you're keeping it out of the areas of the body that are at risk. So it's the most effective and safest way to use fluoride. And I think that's really where we now need to go. And, if we are to take NTP's conclusions seriously, if we are to take the court's ruling seriously, the writing is on the wall. It's time for us to end this program of fluoridation, mass fluoridation of water, and just go to the topical use with toothpaste and other dental products. It's not rocket science. It shouldn't even be controversial. It should not be controversial. It's such a basic common sense, matter, and if anyone believes in the precautionary principle, don't wait for millions of people to be confirmed poisoned before you take protective action. That's what, we should be approaching fluoride with so much more precaution than we do. We've treated it so flippantly, so cavalierly, so recklessly for so long, all based on misplaced confidence in organizations that violated our trust, organizations that saw their role as propagandists, as cheerleaders, as their goal was to increase the number of people who have fluoride added to their water, increase the number of people who have fluoride added to their water. It was a political objective. And it was never about, hey, this is an important matter that affects health. Let's be rigorous in how we approach the science. Let's be neutral. Let's be objective. That never was the case, Derrick. We've been led by cheerleaders who see their role as propagandizing the public to get their political objective achieved. So I'm hopeful, though, Derrick. I really am at this point. I really think we're seeing a change in the worldview on fluoride. And it's really a matter of, it's not a question of if, in my view, it's just a matter of time when the U.S. finally follows Europe's lead.
Yeah, and I hope that is the direction we're going, Michael. You've done such great work on this. I just want to add to this discussion here on the NTP report. I sort of mentioned this earlier, that when the NTP report came out, probably the most widely distributed headline came from the Associated Press, which said, U.S. government report says fluoride at twice the recommended limit is linked to lower IQ in kids. And in my article on this, I was kind of just making note that phrase at twice the recommended limit was repeated over and over, and of course taken by the ADA and other advocates of fluoride to basically say this doesn't apply to the U.S. But actually, in the NTP's report, as you know, Michael, in this 324-page report, lower in the section, it's not at the top, but it's buried in there. It says, however, because people receive fluoride from multiple sources, not just drinking water, individuals living in areas with optimally fluoridated water can have total fluoride exposures higher than the concentration of their drinking water. And just kind of making that point that the judge also made, that this is applicable to the U.S. And I think it, in my mind, it's just another way that the media was sort of forced to admit, okay, the U.S. government agencies making these conclusions, but don't pay too much attention to it because it's at twice the recommended limit. But thankfully, the judge didn't see that study and that conclusion and then kind of go that route. Instead, he exercised, as you said, the precautionary principle here, and really seeing that we have to err on this side of caution, because people are going to be affected well before whatever the definitive limit, the hazard level is. People are going to be impacted well before that. And so I'm really glad to see that both the NTP and Judge Chen went this way. And also, just to your other point, as somebody who has been following closely your work in the lawsuit and in the emails, and then reading through these emails, it was very heartening to see that Dr. Mary Wolf and others in the NTP were actually fighting for their conclusions and were adamant that they weren't going to change different phrases that the anonymous peer reviewers were trying to get them to do, and include certain things that, in my view, were sort of watering down their conclusions, and that they continued to fight. And I think that can give those who have maybe lost some faith and some trust in, quote unquote, the science in the last few years, some faith that there are actually real scientists out there who do want to follow the data where it goes and aren't just bought out by corporate interests, and who aren't just going to lead the people astray. There were good scientists who you probably have never heard of and maybe never will hear of, who were fighting to keep their conclusions alive. And I think that's very important to just acknowledge and thank to them for that work.
And Derrick, I just want to follow up on one point you made, because it's very important, and I should have made it earlier, okay? Because, and I would say the judge's analysis was not a precautionary principle-based analysis. It was a risk assessment analysis, okay? But one of the things that the judge makes clear in his opinion, okay, and which the evidence backed up very much so, is that there are a number of models that we have available for assessing the risk of fluoride exposure, which show that people drinking fluoridated water exceed the observed hazard level, right? So, and just one example of that. At trial, we had data on the urinary fluoride levels in pregnant mothers living in fluoridated areas. And you had the full range, the people with the lowest levels, the people with the highest levels, and whatnot. And what the data showed is there is a significant number of pregnant moms in fluoridated areas, over 5%, who have more fluoride in their body, in their circulating system, than people living in areas with 1.5 parts per million. So you have a complete overlap in fluoride exposures between the so-called high levels at 1.5 and our optimal level at 0.7. So it's not just a situation where we have a insufficient margin of safety. It's also a situation where some people in fluoridated areas are exceeding the levels at which harm has been consistently observed. So I just want to make that clear. This is not just a situation where you're relying on the margin of safety principle. It's also a situation where you have just straight up exceedance of the hazard level in the fluoridated areas.
Thank you for making that point, Michael. I know we got to let you go in just a moment. One last brief question, if you have the second. If for me and for others out there who are ready to go to City Council now, is there any particular area of the ruling or the NTP final conclusion that we should focus on, that we should bring to our local elected leaders?
Yeah, there are a couple really choice, I think, summary statements in the judge's ruling. I know that the Fluoride Action Network has compiled a series of quotations on its website that I would look to and refer to. But there's some really powerful language from the court, and I think it does certainly make sense for those who are going to present the court's findings. Get some of those quotes, put them into a PowerPoint or a nice big poster, because when when you look at that language, it's very clear, and I think it will open minds on this issue. So I think use the court's language when talking about the court's decision.
Perfect. I will go ahead and find those quotations, and I'll include that in the description below, everybody. Thank you all for tuning in. We've been talking with Michael Connett, who's been the lead attorney for the lawsuit against the EPA. Again, Michael, thank you for all your work. Congratulations on your victory. We will be following up and seeing where things go from here on out. Everybody at home, take this information, use it in your local communities, use it to educate your family and friends, and perhaps people who've thought you were crazy or mentioned Dr. Strangelove. And let's continue the fight to get the poison out of our water, not only for us, but for the young ones who are counting on us to take care of them. And until next time, remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free.